I'm Jamie Dimon. I'm the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, and I'm going to tell you about the biggest financial disaster in American history. In 2034, Social Security will end. This isn't a prediction, it's mathematics. And when that day comes, 67 million Americans will see their retirement payments drop by 23% overnight. Last month, I was in a private meeting with the chief actuary of the Social Security Administration, Stephen Goss, a man who's been in this job for 30 years. Pointing to the report on the table, he said to me, "Jamie, the numbers are certain. The trust fund runs out in 2034. What comes after is disaster." I asked him, "Stephen, exactly how much disaster?" His answer shocked me. Someone currently receiving $2,000 per month will drop to $1,540 overnight. That's a 460 monthly loss, $5,520 per year. For most retirees, this means ruin. But here's the truly shocking part. This crisis isn't a surprise. We've known for 40 years. In 1983, during the Reagan era, the last major Social Security reform was made. Even then, they knew that when baby boomers retired, the system would collapse. But they did nothing. Why? Because Social Security is political suicide. No politician wants to touch this issue. Cut benefits, and you lose votes. Raise taxes and you lose votes. Raise the retirement age and you lose votes. So everyone kicks the problem to the next term. But there are no more terms left to kick it to. The mathematics are merciless. Every year, 100 billion more comes out of the Social Security vault than goes in. In 2019, there was a $4 trillion reserve. Now it's $2.8 trillion. But this money is rapidly evaporating. And the situation gets worse every year. Because birth rates are falling, life expectancy is rising. In 1950, there were 16 workers for every retiree. Now there are 2.8 workers per retiree. By 2034, that ratio will drop to 2.3. Simple math, fewer people paying in, more people taking out for longer periods. The system is unsustainable. So what are the solutions? There are three options. First, cut benefits by 23%. Second, raise payroll taxes by 28%. Third, raise the retirement age to 69. All are politically impossible, but mathematics doesn't care about politics. Let me give you these numbers so you understand the seriousness of the situation. To close the Social Security gap permanently, we need $22.4 trillion over the next 75 years. That's more than the entire current national debt. There is no painless solution. But here's the worst part. This isn't just Social Security's problem. Medicare is in the same situation. The Hospital Insurance Trust Fund runs out in 2031, 3 years before Social Security. When both systems collapse simultaneously, we're looking at the complete breakdown of America's retirement safety net. And this is where the real disaster begins, because if Social Security and Medicare collapse together, 67 million retirees will have both their income and health insurance threatened at the same time. People in their 70s and 80s will face impossible choices between food and medicine. What happens in this scenario? Retirees become financial burdens on their adult children. Multi-generational households become the norm out of necessity. Consumer spending collapses because seniors have no money. The entire economy contracts. But here's what terrifies me most about this crisis. It's not just the immediate impact on current retirees, it's the long-term destruction of trust in American institutions. When the most popular government program in history fails, people lose faith in all government promises. The psychological impact will be devastating. For 90 years, Americans have planned their lives around Social Security. They've made career decisions, retirement choices, and family planning based on the assumption that Social Security would be there. That assumption is about to be shattered. This is where I'll tell you the truth nobody mentions. The truth nobody mentions is that the government has been lying about Social Security for decades. They call it a trust fund, but there's no actual money in it. It's just IOUs from one part of the government to another. The Social Security surplus was spent on other government programs years ago. Here's how the scam worked. For 40 years, Social Security collected more in taxes than it paid in benefits. Instead of saving that money in a real investment account, The government spent it on wars, infrastructure, and other programs. In return, they put treasury bonds in a filing cabinet in Parkersburg, West Virginia. That's the trust fund. Now those bonds are coming due. But the government doesn't have the money to honor them. The general fund is running massive deficits. National debt is approaching $35 trillion. There's no money to pay back Social Security without borrowing more money, which increases the deficit further. Stop here, because this detail changes everything about how you should think about government promises. Social Security isn't insurance. It's not a savings account. It's a pay-as-you-go wealth transfer from current workers to current retirees. And when there aren't enough workers, the system collapses. But the truly shocking part had not been revealed yet. The politicians know the system is bankrupt, but they keep promising more benefits. In 2023, Democrats proposed expanding Social Security benefits, while Republicans promised to protect the system without tax increases. Both promises are mathematically impossible. Let me tell you what happened in a closed-door meeting I attended with congressional leadership. This was in early 2024. The topic was long-term fiscal sustainability. I was there representing the banking industry's perspective on government debt and economic stability. The numbers were laid out on the table: Social Security, Medicare, interest on national debt. Together, they will consume 100% of federal tax revenue by 2034. Everything else, defense, education, infrastructure, everything, will have to be financed with borrowed money. I said to the room, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not sustainable. You cannot run a government on borrowed money forever. At some point, the credit markets lose confidence and the interest rates spike. Then you face a fiscal crisis that makes 2008 look like a minor recession." The silence was deafening. Then one senator said, "Jamie, we know the numbers, but we can't vote for benefit cuts. Our constituents would crucify us." Another added, "And we can't vote for tax increases. That's political suicide, too." That's when I realized the depth of the problem. It's not that politicians don't understand the crisis. They understand it perfectly. They just don't have the political courage to fix it. They'd rather let the system collapse than risk their careers on unpopular but necessary reforms. Here's what's going to happen in 2034 when the trust fund runs dry. Congress will face an immediate choice: cut benefits across the board by 23% or find $100 billion in emergency funding. There won't be time for gradual reforms or bipartisan negotiations. The crisis will force immediate action. The most likely scenario is a combination of both: emergency funding to prevent immediate benefit cuts, followed by gradual benefit reductions and tax increases over several years. But the emergency funding will be borrowed money, adding to the deficit and making the fiscal crisis worse. Meanwhile, millions of Americans who planned their retirements around Social Security will face financial disaster. People in their 70s and 80s will have to go back to work. Adult children will have to support aging parents financially. Multi-generational households will become the norm out of economic necessity, not choice. But the ripple effects don't stop there. When 67 million people suddenly have 23% less money to spend, the entire economy feels the impact. Consumer spending, which drives 70% of economic growth, contracts sharply. So far, you've only seen the immediate crisis, but the second-order effects will reshape American society in ways most people can't imagine. The second-order effects will reshape American society in ways most people can't imagine. When 67 million people suddenly have less money to spend, when they can't afford rent, groceries, or medical care, the economic contraction becomes a social revolution. Retail businesses close because seniors can't afford to shop. Restaurants shut down because people can't afford to eat out. Healthcare providers struggle because Medicare payments are also being cut simultaneously. The economic contraction becomes self-reinforcing as each sector's problems make other sectors worse. But here's what makes this crisis uniquely dangerous compared to previous recessions. Unlike typical economic downturns that hit working-age people hardest, this one hits the demographic that votes most consistently. Seniors vote at rates 20 to 30 percentage points higher than any other age group. When their benefits are cut, they will demand action from politicians. The political consequences will be severe and immediate. Every politician who voted against Social Security reform in the past decade will be blamed for the crisis. Every politician who votes for benefit cuts will face furious constituents at town halls. The political system will be paralyzed at the exact moment when decisive action is needed most. Meanwhile, intergenerational conflict will intensify to levels not seen since the 1960s. Young workers will be asked to pay higher taxes to support a system they are convinced won't exist when they retire. Older retirees will demand that benefits be restored to previous levels. The social contract between generations will break down completely. Here's what happened in Greece during their debt crisis that shows exactly where America is headed. When the government could no longer borrow money to fund pensions, benefits were cut by 40% overnight. Elderly people who had worked their entire lives and contributed to the system found themselves living in poverty. Suicide rates among seniors spiked by 35%. Families that had lived independently for generations moved in together to share expenses. The birth rate plummeted because young people couldn't afford children when they were supporting aging parents. An entire generation saw their life savings and retirement security destroyed by institutional failure. But the decision no one expected came next. I decided J.P. Morgan would start planning for a post-Social Security America. We began developing financial products and services designed specifically for a world where government retirement benefits are unreliable or non-existent. Why would I do this? Because I realized that the Social Security crisis, while devastating for individuals, creates massive business opportunities for companies that prepare properly. When government benefits disappear, people desperately need private alternatives. Companies that provide those alternatives will prosper even as the broader economy struggles. We launched new retirement planning services focused specifically on Social Security replacement strategies. We developed investment products designed for people who can't rely on government benefits. We created educational programs to help people understand the coming crisis and prepare for it financially and psychologically. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People were hungry for honest information about Social Security's problems and practical solutions for protecting themselves. Within 6 months, our retirement planning business grew by 300%. More importantly, client satisfaction increased dramatically because we were finally telling people the truth instead of comfortable lies. But here's what surprised me most about customer reactions to our honest assessment of Social Security. Most people weren't angry about the crisis itself. They were grateful that someone in authority was finally confirming what they had suspected for years. They had known intuitively that the system was unsustainable, but nobody in government or finance would validate their fears. That's when I realized something important about the American people. They're stronger and more adaptable than politicians give them credit for. They can handle difficult truths about complex problems. What they can't handle is being lied to and patronized by institutions that claim to protect them while actually betraying them. This brings me to the conversation that changed my entire perspective on government credibility and institutional trust. The conversation was with a 73-year-old client who came to our private banking office in Manhattan. She had $2 million in assets, but was terrified about her financial future. She said to me, "Jamie, I don't trust anything the government tells me anymore. They promised Social Security would be there forever. They promised Medicare would cover my health care needs. Now I find out both systems are going broke and nobody told us the truth." Her fear wasn't really about money. She had enough savings to maintain her lifestyle even without Social Security. Her fear was about institutional credibility and what it means when the most trusted institutions in society turn out to be unreliable. If the government could lie about Social Security for decades, what else were they lying about? That's the hidden cost of the Social Security crisis that nobody talks about. It's not just a fiscal problem that affects government budgets. It's a credibility crisis that affects the entire foundation of institutional trust in American society. When the most popular government program in history fails, trust in all government institutions collapses. Here's what this means for the broader economy and financial system. Institutional trust is the invisible foundation of modern finance. People deposit money in banks because they trust the institutions. They invest in stock markets because they trust the regulatory system. They plan for long-term financial goals because they trust that institutions will honor their commitments. But the truly shocking part had not been revealed yet. The loss of institutional trust creates a psychological feedback loop that makes every subsequent crisis worse. When people don't trust institutions, they change their economic behavior in ways that undermine economic growth and stability. Economic behavior becomes defensive instead of productive. People stop making long-term commitments because they don't trust that the system will support them. They don't start businesses, buy homes, or have children because they're preparing for institutional failure instead of planning for success. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out in countries where government pension systems have failed. In Argentina, after multiple currency crises and pension confiscations, people keep their savings in US dollars hidden at home instead of investing in productive assets. They don't trust banks, stock markets, or government bonds. Capital formation collapses and economic growth stops. That's the path America is on. The Social Security crisis is just the first domino. When people lose faith in the government's ability to keep its most fundamental promises, they lose faith in all institutional promises. The result is economic stagnation and social fragmentation that can last for decades. Here's what happened in 2023 that convinced me this psychological process is already underway in America. For the first time in decades, Americans saved more money in cash and cash equivalents than they invested in stock markets. People are already preparing for institutional failure by hoarding liquid assets instead of investing in economic growth. Bank deposits are at record highs despite interest rates that don't keep up with inflation. Gold purchases have tripled since 2020. Cryptocurrency adoption is accelerating among people who don't trust traditional financial institutions. People are moving their wealth out of institutional systems and into assets they control directly. This isn't irrational behavior. It's a completely rational response to institutions that have proven themselves untrustworthy. But it's also economically destructive for society as a whole. When everyone tries to protect themselves individually by hoarding cash and avoiding risk, the collective result is economic decline and reduced opportunities for everyone. During that period, people constantly asked me what individuals should do to prepare for Social Security's collapse. My answer surprised them. Don't just prepare financially, prepare psychologically. The emotional impact of losing institutional trust is often worse than the immediate financial impact. But most importantly, understand that this crisis represents the end of an entire era in American life and the beginning of something completely different. This crisis represents the end of the era when Americans could rely on institutions to provide basic life security. For 90 years, Social Security represented a social contract. Work for 40 years, pay into the system, and you'll be taken care of in old age. That contract is being broken, and it's not just about retirement. The implications go far beyond Social Security payments. When the most fundamental government promise is broken, all government promises become suspect. Why trust promises about healthcare, education, infrastructure, or national defense if the government can't keep its promises about retirement? The legitimacy of government itself comes into question. This is why the Social Security crisis is more dangerous than most people realize. It's not just about money or budgets. It's about the social contract that holds democratic societies together. When institutions lose credibility, societies become unstable in ways that affect everything from economic growth to political stability to social cohesion. Here's what I learned about institutional collapse from studying similar crises around the world. The pattern is always the same. First, institutions make promises they can't keep. Then, they hide the problems and lie about sustainability. Finally, reality forces a crisis that destroys trust not just in the failing institution, but in all institutions. The recovery from institutional collapse takes decades, not years. It requires rebuilding trust from the ground up, which is much harder than maintaining trust that already exists. Countries that experience institutional collapse typically see their economic growth, social mobility, and political stability reduced for an entire generation. That's what America is facing. The Social Security collapse is just the beginning. When people lose faith in the government's ability to keep its most basic promises, they start questioning everything: the currency, the banking system, the rule of law, the electoral process. Institutional collapse spreads like a virus. Here's what this means for anyone trying to build security in an increasingly unreliable institutional environment. First, don't rely on promises from institutions that have incentives to lie. Politicians promise things they can't deliver because it helps them get elected. They have no incentive to tell uncomfortable truths. Second, build multiple independent sources of security instead of depending on any single institution. Diversify not just your investments, but your entire support system. Government benefits, employer pensions, personal savings, family networks, community relationships. You need all of them working together. Third, prepare for scenarios that institutions claim are impossible. Social Security trustees said for decades that the trust fund wouldn't run out until 2037, then 2036, then 2035, now 2034. Their projections keep getting worse because they're based on political wishful thinking, not realistic assumptions about demographics and economics. Fourth, recognize that individual preparation, while absolutely necessary, isn't completely sufficient. Institutional collapse affects everyone, even people who prepare properly. You can't completely insulate yourself from systemic failures, but you can reduce your vulnerability. But most importantly, understand that this isn't about political parties or ideologies. Both Democrats and Republicans created this crisis through decades of promises they couldn't keep and reforms they wouldn't make. The solution requires honest assessment of mathematical reality, not partisan blame or magical thinking. I'm Jamie Dimon. I'm 67 years old. I've managed trillions of dollars in institutional assets for nearly 2 decades, and I'm telling you that the institutional promises you're counting on for retirement security are not reliable and will not be honored as promised. Social Security benefits will be cut by at least 23% in 2034. That's not my opinion. Or a political position. It's mathematical certainty based on current law and demographic trends. Medicare will face similar cuts in 2031. Government pensions across the country are underfunded and making promises they can't keep. The era of institutional retirement security is ending. A new era is beginning where individuals must provide their own security because institutions can no longer be trusted to keep their promises. But this isn't hopeless if you understand what's happening and prepare accordingly. The people who will survive and thrive in this new environment are those who build independent sources of security instead of relying on institutional promises that won't be kept. The Social Security crisis is the most predictable financial disaster in American history. We know exactly when it will happen, exactly how it will unfold, and exactly what the consequences will be. The only question is whether you'll be ready when institutional promises turn into institutional failures.